Hey, look
Hey,
at that.
calling Chris Anderson in London, looks
I am in
like,
London, yes, and actually in my room here,
in the
oddly enough.
London headquarters.
The London headquarters, yes. And calling with
Okay.
fire in
Chicago,
Chicago,
my
yeah.
kind of town.
That is it,
Little
yeah.
singing on History Happy Hour today.
Yeah, I thought you were going to sing the Arsenal theme song. I don't want to hear what she had.
Good old Arsenal, we're
Yeah,
proud to sing your name. How's
yeah,
that?
yeah, you're right.
Okay, that's close
Thank you.
enough.
Thank you. That's close enough.
All right.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. Look, if you want to go on a trip with me, if you want to go on a trip with Chris, if you desperately don't want to go on a trip with one of us, but want to go on a trip with somebody else,
What else? Yeah.
it's all there at Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours.
Yes.
And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or not watching at all, but listening on the History Happy Hour podcast, thank you for joining us. And today, in just a bit, we'll be talking about the rise and fall of fascism in Italy, a dark tale, if ever there was one.
Indeed.
Let us know you're here and what you are drinking. Chris, what are you drinking today?
Well, I'm doing trying to do dry January,
Oh,
so
I
I'm
see.
doing
I
sparkling
see.
water. And
Starting on January 20th.
well, it's but no time like the present. Right?
Well, I have a wine from that my sommelier Marilyn
Wow.
tells me is from the same region of Italy as Mussolini. So we're going to find out from our guest if that's
I was
true.
going to say,
That'll be one of
yeah.
the first questions. We're going to check on the sommelier.
Hopefully, our guests won't put you in a bad,
It's the Lambrusco. It's
bad
okay.
spot.
We it's a search for truth on History Happy Hour.
Okay.
So who's out there, Chris?
Ah, well, we have John Matthew and John. I'll try to forgive your poor choice in football teams, but we welcome you anyway. And Ron Griswold, Lizzie Borden, Pat Geary. Wow, quite
I
a few
got a
people.
compliment on my singing from Jean Templin, but she put quotes around singing. What is that?
Well, I mean,
Was it
because it
really
was
singing?
singing loosely defined, Rick. I
I
think.
see. George Les is here.
Yeah.
Marilyn Ray Beyer, my sommelier, and all sorts of other people. We do have Brian Peacock drinking a sink pack today, a sink pack special,
You've inspired the
a
legions.
cocktail that is fast becoming the unofficial cocktail of History Happy
It
Hour.
is.
All right, Chris, I think we've probably
Kills.
we should just mention our Patreon supporters.
Yes, we should.
They are awesome people, and
And
we appreciate them. These are our top shelf supporters. We've
they're
added a
becoming
name
awesomer.
to the
Yes.
list, yes, but there are also many people who are not top shelf supporters but still support on Patreon. We do appreciate you all, and that's the site for doing that, patreon.com/history happy hour. We do appreciate that. Okay,
Okay.
can we start the show now?
I think so. The bar is open.
The bar is open. In the dark days after World War I, a new movement swept over Italy. Fascism promised to build a new Roman Empire and restore Italy's greatness. The movement spawned black shirts, violence, and a fellow named Benito Mussolini. And our guest today, John Foote, has written a book called Blood and Power, The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism, and he tells the disturbing story of fascism from 1915 to 1945. John describes himself, I read this on his Twitter feed today, as a historian specializing in Italian stuff, which I thought was about the briefest bio that I could possibly do on the show. He's written several other books on Italian history and sport and joins us from the famous port city of Bristol in the UK. John Foote, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hello, everybody.
Uh,
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So,
we
is the
appreciate it.
Lambrusco from the region where Mussolini was born?
It's close. I think it depends. I don't want to get all too detailed about it, but it's. I think it depends what kind of Lambrusco it is. So we could go down a road, but it's not far away.
Okay, I don't
I
know.
think
Uh,
that's sort of. It's not far away. It's not far
Okay,
away.
we're going with not far away.
there,
Good enough.
there we
I
go.
think that's a
All right.
win. I think that's a win.
Uh,
John, I would describe your book as a bottom up history of fascism in Italy. You write, we know much about Mussolini, but too little about ordinary Italians who lived through the dictatorship. How would you describe your approach, and why did you go this route?
So, I mean, I wanted to get technical, I'd call it micro history. But what I tried to do originally, I wanted to take about 20 individuals, and I wanted to kind of trace the way that they experience this period of fascism, which goes from about the 1920s right up to 1940s. So the idea was to tell the history through these stories of individual biographies. In the end, it was a bit less than that, because some of them ended up on the cutting room floor, some of them didn't work, some of them I just couldn't find out all the information about them. But that was the idea, was to tell the story through in people's lives. And some of them are socialists, some of them are fascists, some of them are Catholics. There's all kinds of different people there. And some of them I got totally obsessed with and wanted to know everything about. And strangely, fascism helped me in that work, because fascism followed people everywhere, especially people that thought were going to be dangerous to it, and kept incredible archival records on everything they did. So they kind of did the work of the historian for the historian.
Yeah. So John, I mean, I think it's safe to say that when people say fascist or think World War II, immediately Germany comes to mind. And I think that there's not enough known about the Italian fascism in Italy. And so just to kind of, give us a baseline really briefly, just a little bit about kind of the rise of Italian fascism, and maybe was it the same as Nazism? Did it differ from Nazism? Where would you want to start this from?
I think that's a really good point, that sort of Nazism kind of tends to dominate everything, even in the studies and people's memories and minds. Italy invented fascism. The word is Italian, fascismo. The first fascist groups were formed. The first meeting of people who called themselves fascists was in 1919 in Milan. It was a very small number of people, and they called themselves fascists. And they really it comes out of the war experience. Most of the people who called themselves fascists had fought in the war, or had strongly supported Italy's participation in the war, which was a very controversial participation. And these fascists, they were a mixture of things, and they changed over time. And be careful. You've got to be careful not to say they're exactly the same all the time from 1919 onwards. But there are some fixed points that we could lay down. One is a very extreme nationalism. A second one is the use of violence, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Mm-hmm. And the third one is anti-socialism. They were also very opposed to kind of liberal democracy right from the start. So those kind of strands are what fascism kind of, you can build it around. You could have a massive debate about the various definitions. Difference from Nazism, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Yeah. In many ways, Nazism molds itself on fascism. You don't get Hitler without Mussolini. Okay. I think it's often seen the other way around. I think the key difference is this centrality of anti-Semitism. But when you say that, you don't want to let Italy off the hook with the way that it used anti-Semitism. Right. Sure, we'll come back to that as well.
Well, so much to get in here, and as you say, I mean, Mussolini takes power in 1922. What is Adolf Hitler doing in 1922? He's on the street someplace in Vienna or whatever. Just something just occurred to me, and I just thought I would ask. We all have a meaning right now that we associate with the word fascist, or word fascism, or fascismo, as you how'd you say it?
Fascismo.
Fascismo. Why did they pick that word? What did it mean to people in 1919, 1920, 1922?
It doesn't mean what it means to us now. They use that word. They actually call themselves fasci di combattimenti. Fasci was something that came from ancient Rome. It was a group of people, and it's also a bunch of sticks. They didn't really mean anything in itself. It was just a group of people who'd fought in the war. Combattimento were combatants, if you like. It takes on the meanings that we associate with it quite quickly after that. When they start to dress in black shirts, they start to use violence in a very modern way, I think. But at that time, it just meant group. It was a kind of more of a neutral term. It was a bit like saying we are a group of of ex-combatants soldiers. And then it took on many other meanings.
And then the word group is, takes on its own meaning, essentially.
And the symbol of fascism was a bunch of sticks in it, bound together. If you go to Italy and look at, actually, you can see that kind of symbol in many other places. It's a kind of widely used symbol, but you see it on lots of buildings still, all over the place.
Weren't those bundles of sticks carried by some Roman officials as a sort of a sign of office?
Yeah, that's right. And that already takes you into the idea that fascism was very much harking back in some of its manifestations to the glory of ancient Rome. Make Italy great again, that kind of idea, which was very that was very much part of what Italy is fallen apart. It's divided. There are too many pacifists. We need to revive that greatness, and that's very much part of a lot of what they're talking about is that.
Yeah. So, John, you kind of touched on this, and this might be a two-part question. So, if it is, I apologize. I'm going to steal a question from Rick, but maybe you could talk a little bit about Italy's experience of World War One and why that is so important to this story. And when I was reading your book, one of the questions that I was asking myself was, is Italian society prone to the violence that we would eventually see under fascism, or is it a byproduct of did World War One and that experience unleash this violence, or does one cause the other, or how's it?
I think the war. So Italy enters the war in 1915, really against the wishes of the majority of the people. All the evidence seems to show that the war is pretty unpopular. There is a very small combative nationalist minority which pushes Italy into the war. And many of those people will turn up in fascism.
And they're allied with England and France.
Yeah, which was also a surprise given some of the previous alliances that Italy had. And the king is a key player. The king is the head of state of Italy. He's a key player in pushing Italy into the war with these already violent, radical nationalist groups, including someone who we should also mention called Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was a poet, radical nationalist, fought in the war, and also kind of a proto-fascist, very important pushing Italy into the war in 1915. Sorry, some strange noises going on. I think someone's coming home, which is probably I did expect.
We can call the police if anything. Give us a signal if you're being held.
Sorry, I'll get back to the First War. The war was brutal for Italy, like it was for all countries. I think, and it was also something that cost very high numbers of lives. But in the popular consciousness of many people in the world, Italy didn't even take part in the war. Right. It's often forgotten. It also divided Italians very radically. And those are the divisions that we'll see in post-war Italy between those who supported the war and those who opposed the war. Very, very broadly, that is what you get in 1919 to 22.
Okay. And Italy lost something like 500,000 soldiers. I mean, they lost far more, say, than the United States did in
570,000, and that's probably an underestimate. And then you add to that the huge numbers of people who were mutilated and blinded and so on. I mean, it really is an extraordinary tragedy, and it touches all parts of Italy. Many of the people on the front, which is often in the mountains, way up in the mountains. 3,000 meters they fought some of the war at, which is crazy.
That's right? 10,000 feet.
Yeah. Were people who are from Sardinia or Sicily who've been plucked, conscripted into the army and never been to Rome, let alone to fight the front. So it was an extraordinary kind of almost a unification, but through this horrible experience.
You call it a mutilated victory.
That's what D'Annunzio called it, and it was a very popular phrase. D'Annunzio was an amazing slogan maker. He came up with all the things that fascism used. They were his slogans. He was very modern in his phrase making. He called the war a mutilated victory. That was partly because many people felt that Italy was betrayed at the negotiating table. Mm-hmm. It had gone through this war and it had got very little out of it. Very little territory. and they wanted more, and that led to a lot of claims on further territory in 1919 to 20.
Yeah, so you come out of World War One. You have socialists, you have fascists. You know, there's sort of an opposition here. One of the elemental parts of fascism is, and maybe it's part of all the political parties, but certainly a part of fascism is violence. And there's a quote from you early in the book. You say, without violence before and during the regime, fascism would never have come close to power. It was fundamental, visceral, epochal, I don't know how to say it, like an epic, and life-changing, both to those who experienced it and those who practiced it. Fascist violence brought something fundamentally new to the political scene, a military party whose use of murders, beatings, intimidation, and destruction swept aside all opposition. And your book really dives into this violence. I would say there's violence on almost every page. Talk about the kind of violence that was the signature, if you will, of fascism, and tell us a little bit about the Squadristi, a word that I learned reading your book.
So I think, in my opinion, this is the great political invention of Italian fascism, which later the Nazis will copy, and other forms of fascism will also copy, which is the political use of violence. But it's not wild violence, it's not chaotic violence, it's not random violence. This is violence that's very directed and targeted. The Squadristi are groups of fascists who start to form themselves into groups, or they call themselves squads, and they start to wear uniform. They wear a black shirt. They're obviously illegal. This is all illegal. This is against the law. And they start to attack certain kinds of people and certain kinds of institutions. They attack socialists, individuals and organizations. They attack offices, trade union offices. They attack people who are against the war. And they do it in a very effective way. They do it in a very extreme way, right from the start. So the squads start to form. They will attack someone's house, burn down a building, go into a town. They've got lorries, they've got equipment, they've got guns. And this is an incredibly effective form of political activity. And it very quickly starts to turn the tide, because Italy in 1990 to 20, it often appeared to many people as if there was going to be a socialist revolution. There were strikes and demonstrations and occupations all over Italy. But this Squadristi, even though there were a very small number of them, used violence in a way that was very modern, very effective, and very didn't care about the implications of it. So it was an extraordinary thing, and I think that is the key political invention. Everything else is secondary to that.
And if I can do a follow-up, Chris, I mean, there's a phrase that comes through a couple of times, which is quite vivid: cudgels and castor oil. Those are some of the weapons of violence.
They're kind of inventing techniques, and one of the things they do is humiliate people. So they make an example of somebody in a public square, and everyone else has to watch this humiliation, this torture, this violence, and that scares all the other people.
Right. So and there's an example of that in this photo. Who is this gentleman, and what's happening here?
So that man is a man called Giuseppe Lemmi. He's a communist in Rome, and this is during the March on Rome, which is when Mussolini and the Italian fascists took power, centrally, and stayed in power. He had been kidnapped in the street. His hair had been shaved off, as you can see. His beard had been shaved off, and they put a sign around his neck saying Lemmi, that's his name. And he was secretary to a very famous communist called Bombacci. And it says Segretario del Porco Bombacci, secretary of the pig Bombacci. So he was paraded around. And it must have been a terrifying experience. It was also reported that he had to drink castor oil, half a litre of castor oil, which has quite dramatic effects.
Diuretic effects.
On your body. And this would be a further form of humiliation. He was forced to shout fascist slogans. So this was for show. That person, he wasn't killed in this instance. He could easily have been killed. But a lot of people saw it. And, that worked. people left in droves, left the trade unions, left the socialist movement, went into hiding, and it worked very quickly.
So, but John, is this violence? How directed is this violence? Is there one person or one group of people saying, okay, Squadristi, I want you to go here and do this, or are these squads kind of acting on their own but under a bigger umbrella?
So that's a really good question, and it's a really important question. So these squads kind of emerge all over Italy in local areas, particularly where socialists are strong, and they all have their local leaders, and they're called Raz, which comes from an Ethiopian term for a leader. And so there are lots of fascist leaders who are leading their own little squadristi. There is some coordination, but not very much in the early years. And then there's a kind of national leadership. And there we have to talk about Benito Mussolini, because Mussolini is the kind of ideologue, the propagandist, the theoretical creator of fascism. But he's also trying to gain control of these squads. Sometimes they're out of control. So it's a many-headed beast at first. And that will continue to some extent. There's always these challenges to... doesn't have a centralized leadership, has a local base, and many of those local Raz will become the leading fascists under Mussolini. The big names, the famous, I'll give you one name, Italo Balbo, who was from Ferrara, which is in central Italy. He became one of the leading fascist politicians after the seizure of power in 1922. He's also celebrated in America because he flew on planes over to America in a sort of very kind of heroic fascist flight. I think there's even a Balbo Square in Chicago.
There's a Balbo Drive, and it's it's very annoying because there's all the east-west streets in the South Loop are named after American presidents, and then there's one named after Ida Wells, who is a great African-American activist, and then there's one named after Balbo, and nobody even knows at this point what it's named after. And there was a Columbus statue that Balbo paid to have put up, and Chris and I walked around and looked at it a few years ago, which has since been taken down by the city, not because of fascism and Balbo, but because of people's concerns about Columbus. So it really is, there's a blind spot here, I think, that people have towards Italian fascists. It's like they're not real criminals. They're not really bad on the same level that you'd never have a Goering Plaza or a Dzerzhinsky Square in Chicago, but it's okay to have a Balbo Drive.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I think he also gets off the hook a bit because he did this flight, but also he died in a very weird way in 1940. He died due to friendly fire, and there were lots of conspiracy theories around that. But he was one of the main. Fascism was Mussolini plus a lot of people who were called gerarchi, hierarchs, and he was one of the hierarchs. In fact, Mussolini was always very worried that he was going to challenge him, sent him off to the colonies, because then he could marginalize him.
And then he got killed by friendly fire.
Yeah,
wow, what a coincidence!
That led to a lot of conspiracy theories about why he got killed.
In any case, a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, so as obviously throughout their rise to power, violence is central to what they're doing. But are they proposing anything else? I mean, because if it's just violence, they're sort of like the Freikorps in Germany, right? But they have to say, okay, we're going to have this violence, but this is what we're going to also give you. So what is the other part?
Yeah, what are they for? I get that they want to put down the socialists, knock the left, but what are they in favor of?
Yeah, I think it's at that point, the things like order and, there's a terrible cliche, which everybody knows, which is making the trains run on time. But it always has a little kernel of truth. Italy, 1919-20 was racked by strikes and disorder and demonstrations. And the fascists said, we can put a stop to all that. We will bring order. But we will also make Italy great again. We will bring you a new empire.
Did they literally use that phrase?
I mean, they talk about a new Roman Empire, so it's very similar to. It's not the literal phase, but it's what it means. It's we were great once, and we're going to have a new empire, and it's going to be centered around Rome, which once ruled the world, and now we're decadent and so on. They also promised things, which they certainly didn't deliver. Of getting rid of corruption and getting rid of kind of decadent parliamentarianism and things like that. So they, for many middle class people in Italy, socialism represented something quite scary, and the socialists actually explicitly said many times, when we take power, we're going to get rid of you because we won't need you anymore. So they were also they were a good bet for many people. I think even the liberal state, which kind of allows all this violence to take place, doesn't really do much about it. Kind of thinks that it can control the fascists, and that's a terrible error, because once the fascists take power in 1922, they turn on. Once they got rid of the socialists and the unions, they turn on the liberals and many Catholics as well. So it wasn't, they couldn't control them. And in fact, they then abolished democracy.
Well, we have a question from one of our members of our audience here who says, how could violence have prospered without government indifference? And there is this moment. There does seem to be a lot of government indifference, police indifference, or even favoring the fascists. And then there's this moment where the fascists march on Rome. The prime minister wants to call out the army and deal with this. And he needs the king to sign the decree. And the king says, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do that. And he ends up, even though they have this tiny sliver of representation in parliament, he makes Mussolini prime minister. So why this complete ineffectiveness, essentially, in resisting this violent attempt to overthrow the country?
I think it's worse than ineffectiveness. I think what you see in 1919 to 21 is active collusion between the police, the army, and the fascists. To this extent of giving them equipment and guns and allowing them to do what they wanted. On very, very few occasions do the police or the army fire on or arrest fascists. So they're actively working together. And I think when the March on Rome comes around, it's too late. The king refuses to sign the state of siege decree, which is a very famous moment in Italian history, because that allows the fascists to win. But I think by that time, he couldn't be sure to rely on the army at all. That is the problematic moment for a state if it can't rely on its own army to obey orders. So, the army in 1922 is sort of shooing the fascists into saying, just kind of letting them do exactly what they wanted. So I think it's a more serious than indifference. It's actually actively working together. And there's been some fantastic sort of work at a local level demonstrating that.
So, John, given their violence right from the very start, and given that at least at the beginning, socialists and communists are bigger groups, organized groups, than fascists, what's the level of public support for this movement? I mean, is this a small group that takes over the country and says, this is how it's going to be, folks? Or is there popular support? And does it change? I mean, that's
in some ways, that's the 64,000. That's such an important question, and it's often quite hard to ascertain that kind of thing, because especially under a dictatorship, how do you know, what support is? In the rise to power, I'd say it's always a minority movement. Whenever they stand in elections, free elections, and there's elections in 1919 and 1921, those are the last two probably free elections. 24, there's a huge amount of intimidation. They get, maximum 30 deputies, 30 MPs, right?
Out of how many?
That's all, 30. It's nothing, right? So all the evidence points to them being quite strong minority support. There's quite a lot of passive support. Yeah, let's let them do this, but we don't really like them. This is kind of distasteful. They'll do the dirty work for us, but we'll control them afterwards. I don't think there was ever anything like a majority support for them. There's a lot of very active people involved. And as we know, I'm sure from other programs, that active minorities tend to make history. and they made it in this case, but they never had a majority support. And once in power, that's another huge question, whether they achieved support. I think that's a more complicated question. By the 30s, probably there was a degree of, acceptance of the regime, but that's after a massive amount of repression had taken place and all opposition had been swept away.
But I mean, it's pretty clear what the fascists' policy is, right? I mean, they're violent and they're brutal, and nobody seems to be calling them out, really, or they're just. I mean, how do they?
Mussolini plays the statesman. I mean, he comes into power and he says, right, that's the end of all that. That was a necessary, we had to use violence. It was necessary to get rid of all the evil socialists and trade unionists. And now in power, I'm going to act like a statesman. I'm going to act responsibly. I'm going to bring in moderate people into my cabinet. But they never really stopped the violence. They brought it into the state. So he and other leaders extremely clever in turning this off and on, and in using it to their advantage. And the liberal state, which was by that time very weak, was unable to control the movement. And once Mussolini was in power, he used it very well. Nobody took Mussolini seriously. That's another thing, another great error. Mussolini had been a socialist. He changed his mind. They thought this man is not a serious person, but in fact, he was extremely able at managing power and at managing the fascist movement as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of different directions to go here, but one of the things I wanted to bring out is that you have some of your own relatives, ancestors, members of your family who in Italy who had some positive feelings towards fascism and towards Mussolini. I mean, that you heard about at a young age.
Yeah, I tell this story when I start the book about my great grandmother who was Italian, and my dad used to tell this story because we would all be sitting around. A lot of my family were politicians, and it was a very political family, and there'd always be these arguments, about everything. Everything was always an argument, but in a fun way. And he told me the story where somebody accused someone else in my family of being a fascist, but in a kind of, not slightly over the top way. And my great grandmother, who never said anything, suddenly pipes up and said something like, and I don't know the exact quote, but my dad would tell it like this. She would say, fascism, how wonderful it was. And I use that story partly because it's a funny story and an interesting story, but also it comes back to the question before, for some people, fascism was indeed wonderful. It did resolve a lot of the problems that they had seen, and they thought the world was ending. And I also have used material by my grandmother and my great uncle who had lived in Italy and had witnessed some of the events that I describe in the book. My great uncle claims, I think he's a bit of a fantasist, but claims to have seen one of the attempts on Mussolini's life in 1926 in Bologna. So I was able to use this strange family material. I'm actually trying to get Italian citizenship at the moment. So I've been reading a lot about my own family.
I want to know ultimately if this book helps or hurts that effort. So we're going to check back in with you in a year or so to find out. Chris, should we take some of these questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask. So we have a question from one of our viewers, John Matthew. And he wants to know, would fascism in Italy have been possible without Mussolini?
Yeah, I think it would have been. It's a good question. Mussolini was very important because he was able to manage the movement, and he was also a fantastic journalist. So his skills were in journalism, and writing, but also running newspapers, and of course that's the main form of information and propaganda in the period we're talking about. So he's very important to me. But I certainly think fascism could easily have come to power and stayed in power without Mussolini. There were many other leaders who of similar kind of skills and skill sets and different skill sets. For example, or there's a man called Dino Grandi. There are others. So I think important, but not essential.
Well, I just think that's interesting because obviously I don't think anybody could envision, say, the Nazi Party without a Hitler, right? But you're saying that this movement was different than that, right? It had more,
Had many heads.
yeah, many had.
Kind of Mussolini was quite good at, the movement had different forms of power. That it spread power to some extent. It was a hierarchical movement, but it also spread power locally, which is something in Italy that is very a wise thing to do because of the importance of regionalism and localism. So I think there was a cult of Mussolini, which was created for propaganda purposes in the 20s and 30s, which would made him out to be a superman and a great man, and but also a man of the people, and that's important to the propaganda of the regime. But it's not actually how the regime works. It works through controlling very carefully what people do and an incredible, extensive secret police force, which is really, the same kind of thing that you find in Soviet Russia, I think. And, the word totalitarian was first applied to that regime. And I think by the 20s and 30s, it is a totalitarian regime. Every aspect of people's lives is controlled.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting today with John Foote, who's the author of the book Blood and Power, The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism, a book on the history of fascism from about 1915 to 1945. And we have another question that came in that parallels something that I wanted to say. Wally Morrison says, please put the rise of fascism in Italy in context to other events in the world at that time. And specifically, is there a compare and contrast with Nazism, with communism and Stalin, Nazism and Hitler, the other fascist in Spain? Is there something that's unique about the Italian version, or how, why are all these things? Are they all kind of bubbling up for the same reasons? Kind of, what's your take on that?
I think, in a very broad way, they are bubbling up for the same reasons. With this, the rise of socialism, the opposition to that, this combination of radicalism and nationalism, which is what fascism is at its heart, and violence, is true to all of those regimes and movements that you mentioned: Portugal, Spain, Germany. That the other global event that kind of is the context to where fascism comes from is the Russian Revolution, and the socialists in Italy, who had always been quite sort of moderate, moved rapidly to the left in post-war Italy and really want to imitate Russia, and that the fear of that is part of what fascism taps into. In terms of Nazism, the Nazis try and copy what goes on in Italy. They see it as a model, and they do copy lots of it. I mean, the Beer Hall Putsch is an attempt to copy the March on Rome, which is a complete disaster. And, it takes Hitler 10 years to get to the same stage. But actually, a lot of what happens was the taking of power, the street violence, the constitutional, on the face of it, assumption of power by Hitler, which in fact then turns into dictatorship. They're directly taken from the Italian experience. The provocation of the Reichstag fire, a lot of that also took place in Italy. So I think there are lots of parallels, but I don't think, I think that you don't get Hitler taking power without Mussolini. He's a big ally ideologically, but also practically. And, Italian troops are in Spain as well. And it could be said that they're kind of decisive to Franco's victory. So they're working together, these nationalists, which is quite a weird idea if you think of it, already from the 20s onwards.
They're internationalists. Oh, wait a minute, no.
International nationalists, yeah. It's always a weird one. The kind of alliances amongst fascists is always a strange one. But they did work together. That balance of power, if we come towards the late 30s, the balance of power starts to shift away from Italy towards Germany. And that's fatal for Mussolini. So Mussolini is no longer the dominant partner in that alliance. Italy becomes a partner that follows slightly blindly into something that it's too big. It can't cope with.
It doesn't end well. Yeah, we don't want to give away the end of the story, but it doesn't end well for Il Duce
Benito,
or
yeah.
Italy.
So Ted, what are the other areas that I think we should discuss? A quote from your book that I wanted to read. You say that Italy's Shoah has often been played down or excused. A powerful myth emerged which claimed that the Italians were fundamentally good people who could never have committed such hideous crimes as those perpetrated by the Nazis. Italy and Mussolini, it was argued, were forced into passing the discriminatory decree. At the end of the day, it was often said that the Italian Holocaust was not as bad as that which hit the Jews in many other countries. And one of the things that startled me when I was reading your book is one of the martyrs of the fascist movement is Jewish. And there are large numbers of Jewish people involved in fascism's rise. So I know this is like a big question, but sort of the place of Jews in this whole movement and where does this, how does this all play out for them?
So I think the first thing to say is the Italian Jewish community is very small. Okay, yep. So 60,000, something like that. But also, despite that smallness in numbers, is actually very influential in terms of politics, in terms of other things. There have been Jewish prime ministers of Italy, one half Jewish, one Jewish. So influential in a political sense, and also very patriotic community, freed by the unification of Italy in 1860. Not going too much detail, liberated the Jews from the ghettos, which had been set up by by the Catholic Church and by the pre-unification governments. So they were very attached to the Italian state, and many of them joined the fascist movement at quite high levels when it broke out, and they saw it as a way of attaching themselves to their pride in Italy. Many had fought in the First World War. Now, the anti-Semitism is there right from the start, but it becomes much stronger in the 30s, and it is the alliance with Hitler which sparks it, but it is also homegrown. And in 1938, Mussolini passes these very, very stringent anti-Semitic laws, which, in a series of decrees signed by the king, which remove Jews from various aspects of public life, schools. You can see in that poster, they're not allowed to own property, they're not allowed to own businesses, and slowly their kind of rights are taken away over a period of years. They're marginalised in Italian society through these discriminatory laws, which are a great shock to them. They weren't expecting it. And here we're into the Second World War, when the Nazis are in charge of Italy, alongside Italian fascists, they start to deport Italian Jews to Auschwitz, mainly to Auschwitz, and about 10,000 die in Auschwitz. Others are killed on Italian soil. So there's an alliance which allows that to happen. It's often been, as I said, it's often been played down or ignored, but in the last 20 years, those kind of ideas have been almost entirely debunked by a series of brilliant historical books and articles in Italy and elsewhere. And no historian really can make that argument anymore. So that's the kind of the story in about 5 minutes. But there were to say about it.
So before we went on the air today, you and Chris were bonding over the fact that you're both Arsenal fans, which was lovely.
It was moving, wasn't it?
It was a kind of a special moment. And you've written about sport in Italy. That is one of the areas that you've written about. And you also write about fascism. You said, quote, "From the beginning, fascism understood the power and reach of sport." So, I think that many of us might call to mind Hitler and the 1936 Olympics, but again, Mussolini's there first with the 1932 World Cup or 34, I can't remember which year, and all sorts of other stuff. Tell us, just to touch on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, right from the start, even if you look back to the 20s, Italian fascists at a very high level are involved in football clubs, building stadiums, putting a
You
lot
said
of
there was
money.
one day that they opened 500 stadiums in one day.
Yeah, they really understood the power of football. And in fact, there's an enormous stadium in Bologna that is opened by Mussolini that I write about in the book. It's still there. You can go and see it. It's an amazing building, and it had high above the stadium had this incredibly large statue of Mussolini on a horse, looking down at the ground. So they used sport. They understood a lot of things about popular culture, film, radio, cinema. They were very, very modern. It was the first modern totalitarian regime in that sense. They used sport to create consensus, to create participation. And in 1934, Italy organised the second World Cup, Football World Cup in Italy, and won it. Surprise, surprise, you might say. And it was organised as a political event. Just, I mean, I don't want to make facile comparisons, but quite similar way to the way that Qatar recently organised Football World Cup. Organised to bring as much attention and consensus to Italy and to Mussolini as possible. They also went to France with the Italian team, won the 1938 World Cup. So they created a very, very high level football team. And this crossed over lots of other sports, cycling, and many other sports, boxing, which I talk about in the book. Which the one thing about you've got to be careful of if you're a regime working with sport is that things can go badly wrong. And with the Italian boxer Primo Carnera, he was enormous. This enormous guy who'd been born in northern Italy. He was like hugely tall and had massive muscles, and he became world champion. But then he got knocked down a lot by Joe Louis, and the Italian fascists banned all photos of him lying on the canvas. There were these things called veline. So the press was completely controlled under fascism, and they sent out these little notes, which were called veline because they were on very small bits of paper. And one of these velines, and they've kept them. They're archived, and they said no pictures of Carnera on the canvas, and that was like banned. So yeah, that you can go wrong, and then he was quickly dropped as a figure.
So John, one of the things that I've always been curious about and was fascinated by when you kind of touch on it a bit in the book is, given that the fascist regime glorifies violence and they talked about an empire and, little boys dressing up in uniforms and playing soldier and all this sort of thing, I think it's safe to say that the Italians didn't really perform as stellarly in that department during the Second World War as other countries. Why do you think, there was so much flash and so little bang? Or I guess, why did they just not? This was their moment, right? They had.
Yep. Yeah, it was their moment, and I think it shows a lot about whether that was how much the regime was propaganda and how much was it reality. Right. So, I mean, I put a little caveat in, which is the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, which involved 1 million Italians, and they put a lot of, and that was seen as a military success. Mm-hmm. But I'll leave that one aside. But that's a fascinating subject. There's been lots of work on that, and a lot of violence is then transferred to the colonies, and there's a genocide more or less there. But the Second World War, I think it tells you a lot, because firstly, Mussolini waits until France is basically defeated before jumping on the bandwagon. So he's a very opportunistic decision to enter the war, even though, according to the Pacts of Skill, he's meant to enter the war immediately as soon as Germany does. He doesn't. But I think he knows that, the Italian army is neither prepared nor ready, and nor is there much enthusiasm for war, which is very interesting, because that must be a difficult thing for a fascist to admit to themselves. Of course, that's not what they're saying publicly, but if you look at what's going on behind the scenes, for example, the diaries of Galeazzo Ciano, who's the foreign minister, tells you the truth of the.
I was just actually going to bring that up, and he was Mussolini's son-in-law also. But when you read those diaries, Mussolini is filled with indecision and doubt about whether following Hitler is a good idea, and yet he's ultimately like the man riding the tiger. He doesn't have any idea how to get off.
No, I mean they think they can win, and they do win in France quickly. But then it all goes badly wrong. And why does it go badly wrong? Partly because of Hitler's strategy and, that the sort of crazy idea to conquer everything, but also because there isn't really that much enthusiasm, even in the army, for a fascist war. There are, and again, you come back to what I said before, a minority of very radical fascists in the army who are really up for it, but the vast majority are not up for it. And that tells you something about fascism. Was it really about more repression than about a great enthusiasm, with all those pictures of everyone cheering Mussolini? Okay, how many of them are actually cheering Mussolini, and how many of them have to do it? How fake is it? And I think the war shows you the defeat in Greece, the disaster in Russia. It's just one defeat after the other. The defeat in Africa, and it very quickly falls apart.
Yeah.
And Mussolini going. I firmly believe if they hadn't got into the war, Mussolini could have easily lived like Franco and died in his own bed. And there's some great dystopian novels where Mussolini's still alive in the 60s, which come out, which I'm really enjoying because I've been reading. But I think it tells you a lot about how popular the regime was.
Yeah.
At the end of the war, well, of course, Mussolini is deposed, which is an amazing story by itself. The Germans, Otto Skorzeny, drops in. They get their hands on him. They kind of make him this prime minister again, or leader again, but in a kind of a pro forma way. He is eventually executed by partisans along with his mistress. Because your book is less about Mussolini than it is about all of the other people who took part in this movement, are there repercussions for sort of the lower and mid-level fascists and black shirts and Squadristi leaders? Or do they all just kind of get to go back home and say, oh, never mind, and just kind of get on with their lives? Which way does it go? Are there trials like Nuremberg, or is it all just, let's just bury it all and hush it up?
So there's two things there. One is in the immediate moment after the liberation, after the Allies, the Americans and the British liberate Italy in bits, that they're going up from Sicily. It takes quite a long time, but every time they liberate a place, there's a lot of bloodletting, and the people who get killed are mainly fascists. Okay, so key fascists are taken out and shot. We don't know how many, but we're talking 15,000, quite a lot of people. Okay, so it's called the Resa dei Conti, the settling of accounts. Mm-hmm. So in that immediate aftermath, a lot of ex-Squadristi, high-level fascists are shot, just summarily, including that Starace, one of the most high-level fascists, who's kind of goes out for a jog, bizarrely, and is shot in the back. This is Starace there he's got a kind of gymnastics kit on.
This is him moments before he's executed.
Yeah, this is in Milan in 1945, and he was a key figure in the regime. He'd been a bit marginalized, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But if you got through that as a fascist, you probably would be okay. There were lots of trials, but lots of them ended in nothing. There was a big amnesty passed, which gave massive benefits, because even the socialists and communists who'd come back to Italy were worried about divisions again and wanted to bring Italy together and didn't want to punish even the top level fascists. So most of them got away with it, which made a lot of people very angry. There was no Nuremberg, and that is a problem, I think, because there's no real coming to terms with what happened. Germany certainly did come to terms up to a certain point with its past. Italy is more complicated, you see, because they changed sides. Because we actually won the war, we didn't lose the war, we're on the right side, and then you don't really deal properly with it. And I think that's kind of what's happened a lot in post-war Italy, is that there's been kind of either forgotten or reinvented or played down.
But why do you think it is, John, that even now in Italy, that, I mean, you talk about the site where Mussolini is buried, and it's a fascist kitsch festival 3 times a year, right? That would never happen in other countries. Why is fascism almost cool in some respects today? That there's not,
I think partly that reason of wanting a repacification very early. In 1946, the communist leader who'd been in Moscow for the 30s, an amazing figure in many ways, very dark figure, a very interesting figure, very contradictory figure, a man called Palmiro Togliatti. He comes back to Italy and he says, we can't punish, we've got to bring everybody together, and passes this very, very generous amnesty. So there's the idea that let's cover up the past, let's not talk about it. And and therefore there's a toleration of people who still believed in Mussolini. There's a party that's formed which has a direct connection to Mussolini. It gets about 8 or 9% of the vote for most of post-war Italy, although the current prime minister comes out of that tradition. So there's a toleration of it, and it's not seen as important. Whereas I think Spain is really interesting because Spain has now taken away Franco's body from the huge monument of the fallen, which he created when he was alive. And they've done that. They've kind of de-fascistized it, even though it's very fascist. But Italy is struggling with that, and will struggle with this kind of government in power, I think, as well.
We're almost at the end of our time, but I have to ask this. It's 2023. Is fascism making a comeback? And to the degree it might be, what lessons does the Italian experience of 1919 to 1945 hold for the world today?
I mean, I think it depends how you define fascism, but I think certainly authoritarian movements are on the rise across the world. And I think if there's one lesson I would take from the period I studied, is that we need to take things very, very seriously indeed. Like, let's take a very current example, what happened in Brazil 2 weeks ago. Okay, you could see that as a bit of a joke, ragbag attempt, not very well planned, or in historical context, you might see it as something very, very, very frightening and which has to be taken very seriously. So I think, fascism was kind of seen as a laughing stock, not taken seriously, seen as something that could be controlled, and it wasn't. And I think that's the lesson I would take from in current is not to tolerate things that are undermining democracy and the rule of law.
John Foote, thank you so much for joining us today for this really fascinating discussion.
Absolutely.
And I want to remind everybody that this book is called Blood and Power, The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism. It's just out, pretty recent, and really a lot of amazing and surprising stuff in there. I was underlining all the way through. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to the listeners as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And Christopher, we have a change of pace.
Yeah, we need a little
next
uplift,
week. So today was fairly dark.
Yeah, it's fairly.
And we're going to lighten it up a week from now. What are we going to do?
We're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, food. We're going to combine food and history.
Yes.
Look at that.
And we're going to talk to Rossi. We are continuing an Italian theme here. You go for the last name.
No. That sounds Greek, though.
Hang on. We're going to bring John back. Oh, yeah. Maybe it's a Greek name.
It's a Greek name.
I just thought maybe John could pronounce this, but I'll let him. I'll keep him off the hook. Rossi Anastopoulos, author of Sweet Land of Liberty, A History of America in 11 Pies. A tasty subject, for sure. A little slice of...
All right, let's keep the puns going.
Yeah, I'm going to just try very hard to, but history in a tin, I don't know. But I'm looking forward to it.
History, yeah.
Because as she points out, we have pie as part of the Thanksgiving tradition. Pie is what they were serving at the lunch counter when it was when the sit-ins started happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. American is apple pie is an expression, but apple pie is not actually American. So we're going to try to dive into all this stuff and do something a little bit different on that show. So I think that sounds like fun.
It should be fascinating.
And I appreciate everybody who joined us today. Thank you so much for being here. And please come back and check out our website, which is historyhappyhour.com, and all the other shows going back decades. No,
it seems like it.
Seems like decades, but years. Anyway, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.